Aaron wrote a book. If you haven't picked up the book, I do encourage you to read it. And I thought we could start this session off just hearing the voice of Aaron in terms of what was his passion to write the book, what was the gap that he saw in the market, and does he still feel that the same perspectives that he wrote in Predictable Revenue are still valid? So Aaron, just really look forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks, Cindy, and welcome everybody. Now, I wrote this book in 2000, or published in 2011, about not quite 6 years ago. And the gap in the market, which is still there, was, companies. There's probably 3 big ideas that were in the book. I saw companies didn't really understand that lead generation drove growth, not number of salespeople. Right? Historically, if you wanted to double sales, you would double your sales team. It's not really how it works. You need to double your leads. Another idea related to that is that salespeople shouldn't prospect. There should be prospectors who prospect. I mean, salespeople should prospect a little bit, but be very targeted. So this idea of sales specialization, right? In Silicon Valley now, this is how it's done. Everyone specializes their sales teams. Prospectors who prospect, closers who close, account managers or customer success teams that manage customers. But still broadly across, outside the tech world and even with bigger companies, and it's still the exception, not the rule, that companies specialize their teams. Excuse me. And just the last one is, part of this was the idea of predictability. Companies are focused on hitting their quarterly number or year number, but it was always a scramble, and just the idea of what if you could step back and create a predictable system so you're not scrambling month to month or quarter to quarter. So those ideas gaps are still there in mid-2000s when I worked at Salesforce, when I published the book, and today. I mean, things change, but people still have the same struggles. It's like as people get better, things get harder.
Thanks, Aaron. So Aaron, just to continue the conversation on the research in the book, and also obviously you've been continuing to write, can you just share a couple of ideas behind the book and its success that you think, if there's just 2 takeaways from today's session, you really want to ensure that everyone is, thoughtful and top of mind applying?
Yeah. Well, on one hand, let me talk. The book itself was very successful, is very successful, because it took a long time to distill some of these ideas down to be very simple for people to understand and follow. And I think that is a lesson for people today, because there's so much information out there that just publishing content is just sort of gets lost in the noise. Like, what can you do to really, I think people who are overwhelmed, what can you do to really simplify your key ideas? What can you try to do to boil it down so there's not 20 steps to do, but try to do 3? So that was said at a high level, one of the things that made the book very successful. It's easy to read, like simple ideas that people got like, oh my God, this is how it should be. Now, to take one of those ideas, so one of the core ideas was this idea that if you buy in that lead generation is what drives growth, not the size of your sales team. Of course, there's some kind of correlation, but salespeople should be more like fulfilling sales rather than driving sales. And I don't want to get caught up in semantics, but people saw this fact of, wow, if I specialize my sales teams, and I have prospectors who prospect, closers who close, and when I have prospectors who are dedicated to it, they can be really good at it. They can be very effective at it, at getting into those companies that I'm trying to get into. I don't have to wait for people to call me. I can go out and talk to them, and I can do it in a very predictable way. I have a prospector who's doing 1,000 emails a month and 200 calls, and I get 20 appointments. That turns into 10 sales qualified opportunities. It turns into 2 customers a month. Predictable appointments can generate predictable revenue, and that really, I think the resurgence of prospecting, of outbound sales and outbound prospecting, is in large part because of the book. So, and I think people also took to it there because it was very detailed and very tactical for them. They could really get their head around why should I do this and how do I do it?
Thanks, Aaron. So it's your turn to ask me a question, Aaron.
That's right. You're the slide master, though.
I am. I do have the control bunny.
Yes, I'm at your mercy. And listen, I was actually curious because what I found at big companies, and they're very slow to adopt a lot of this because it's, I just found it so complicated. But at Xerox and Accenture, what did you learn or what did you find in terms of either trying to develop or implement the predictable revenue practices?
I think there's a few things. You're right. It's sometimes slow to mobilize process change in large global companies, but one thing about certainly Xerox, it grew up in the Six Sigma total quality, so the disciplines and I'd call it the accountabilities for recording account history and getting that knowledge into CRM infrastructure, even though it's difficult, is definitely a very mature practice. I found the same thing at Accenture. There were actually 5 key things that I wrote down that I thought were important observations, and it's always good to reflect, right? Because over the last 10 years, we've been in so many different organizations, small, mid, and large, and sometimes now that gives you that panoramic view of different perspectives. But both of those organizations have extremely clearly defined sales gates integrated into their sales practices, but they've gone beyond the simplicity agenda. They also, underneath each of those sales gates, have specific key questions or inspection questions in terms of inputs and outputs, so they actually can validate that in fact you are really at the next sales gate and logic. Just to give you an example, if you're at the contract stage, there can be very specific questions that actually can further, I'd call it validate the predictable revenue on a commit that you're making for a forecast. Is the budget approved, and have we covered the decision makers, and how well do we know them in terms of that relationship maturity, knowing full well that the budget is there, and that the decision times that are being forecasted in fact are the same time frames that the client or customer is advising you. So we find that the more mature companies spend the time to be really crisp and clear on the process constructs that are underlying their sales logic. The other point, I think, is the estimation of close dates, which obviously, the more mature, experienced sales resources are far usually more accurate. But obviously we know the discounting that goes on with finance, especially in publicly traded companies. But both of those companies put a lot of credence on the close date and the quality then of the sales professional putting in that estimate. So dates count and dates are measured. So a lot of the, I call it practices or inspection practices around those are really, really mature approaches. I think also the recording of lost deals and the knowledge underneath the win and loss factors, underneath contract cycles, are both very mature practices. You can actually see what are the patterns underneath, so you can actually drive improvements in the organization. The fourth point was the responsibility and the accountabilities, just being very clear on, the job descriptions, the KPIs, the reward and recognition practices. There's a lot of support systems to drive predictable revenue that you see in the larger entities. But probably the most distinctive quality that I would have to applaud Xerox on is that they have an incredible celebration culture of sales and sales results, but along the journey. So they'll celebrate, in the moments on a daily basis, and that kind of foundation reinforces the overall operating practice. I think sometimes in the fast-paced world that we live in, we don't take the time to pause and to recognize our talent. So those are, 5 things that I saw that made a difference. We're fortunate now, to be looking at some of these large global data sets and, applying different methods. And, we couldn't do what we do in our company without, companies that have disciplined practices. So hopefully that gives you some context, Aaron, of, my experience in those 2 companies.
Yeah, you have to need a lot of the resources and the background data to nail a lot of those details down.
Exactly, we sure do. So Aaron, and we can kind of play on this one, but obviously as you're out talking to people how to drive more predictable revenue and improve their practices, what mistakes do you see companies making out there in discerning those key nuggets in your book and then putting them to practice?
Yeah, well, a few of the key ones. The first is for smaller companies, And I'm talking about, under $1 million, so small, medium, large, smaller companies who might have one salesperson or two salespeople, or maybe the founder's doing the sales. The mistake they make is thinking, you know what, I can't specialize yet because I'm too small. I can't have prospectors prospecting, closers closing, and account management because I only have one salesperson or two salespeople. But the principle in this case is focus. It's people doing fewer things better. And if you're even one person, an entrepreneur who's selling, the way you would implement this idea is by blocking out time on your calendar. You'd specialize your time. Focus time for whatever that important thing is you're not getting to. Like it could be prospecting, there could be instead of customer success. That's for very small companies, realizing the specialization can't be too small. For medium companies, and maybe that's a few million in revenue up to a few tens or hundreds of millions of revenue. A common mistake is hiring too many prospectors too fast, or overhiring, either because usually it's if they're building a team, an outbound team up front, they don't have the prospecting system defined and successful. They have too many cooks in the kitchen. And it's easier to start with a team when you're sort of brand new of like 2 or 3 or 4 people. And for 3 to 6 months, you refine the system. How are they going to make phone calls or send emails and track it in your CRM, and like all these things that go into defining the outbound system before scaling it up. And that's what Applia, which was the #1 fastest growing software company a couple of years ago in the States, that they did. They had 3 prospectors at first. They were a client, like maybe it's actually 2012 when we started with them. 6 months, had the system nailed down, and then they hired 40 more prospectors. So in other words, you want to sort of start slow down to speed up later. And just one last thing for the big companies, again, like Accenture's, IBM, or SAP and Oracle being customers, it's just so complicated there that, I don't call it politics. It's a mistake is, well, we already have this big inside sales team that's doing all this telemarketing, and there's these breakdowns between divisions, like a financial services division or like a mid-market financial services closers, who are supposed to be able to tap into the inside sales group, but for many reasons it just doesn't work out. It's not really feasible. It's not practical. And so they're sort of left to their own devices. And according to the leadership, they should be able to use them, but they can't, and they're not allowed to develop their own, I would say, skunkworks or private team or their own approach. So it's sort of, they're like damned if they do and damned if they don't. So there's not letting their sales teams be more flexible with how they hire and how they run their teams.
So Aaron, just to build on that point there in terms of the agility side, and obviously with the speed that we're all running at these days, how do you think we can help the larger companies, build more of that cultural mindset? Any thoughts there, or is it just so broken that it's just a tough number?
Big companies, they're just complicated, so it's just very hard. It's not that people don't want to change. There's, think in Oracle, there's so many. I mean, in Oracle and SAP, most salespeople, at least through my experience, they still use Excel a lot to track their target accounts and prospects, and because their internal systems are just they're over. It's like the complexity is impossible to manage for a big company. It's just, I think it's impossible for Oracle to make their system usable for whatever. I don't know if they have 60,000 salespeople, people in sales, or whatever the number is. It's so ginormous that I think it just would boggle my mind. And I think it's probably accepting that and recognizing it and finding some balance between letting people do what they need to do to be successful while doing what they also need to do to make sure the team and corporate side get what they need. I don't have an answer, but I know it's just complicated.
Yeah, I certainly empathize with the complexity. I think the overlay of business intelligent tools that enable the views that a sales professional might want can certainly provide more agility, so that the data, obviously, and the knowledge resides in central repositories, which, as losing that knowledge is an issue if that's not kept within some central size system, right? Especially in large global companies.
Yeah.
So just to kind of project forward a little bit, what do you think the future holds for predictable revenue? I know you've been busy writing and got also new research coming out, but what are your thoughts on where we're going now?
Well, so one way to answer the question is, for us, the company and the book and the brand versus the ideas. But let me start with, for us, what I see is that the same problems exist, and they probably will always exist. Like it's never going to be enough leads. It's always going to be hard to hire good people. It's like, again, as you get better, it's not like as a weightlifter, you get stronger, but then you put heavier plates on. So people have to adapt, and so we try to help publish. We have other ways of writing email templates, for example, but it's sort of hard to, how do we struggle to publish them in a way that's sort of simple for people to follow? So what I see is, how do we help people be more insightful about their prospects? Because if they're more insightful about their prospects as a company, as a person, it makes it easier for them to target and message people more effectively. So in our vehicle, our program that's sort of for mass teaching companies, it's called Predictable University. It's our low-cost or very affordable way to get very detailed tactical training on outbound prospecting. One of the things at the very beginning we have trainees do, whether they're SDRs or salespeople, is to go interview, the assignment is to go interview 3 customers or prospects. So we find is, if you can go talk, I don't know why it's so hard. I mean, you get a schedule, but go talk to the people you're trying to sell to. Find out how they think, what they say, their keywords, key phrases, and it gives them such a much more intimate version or feeling for what that person is like and what they deal with, so that when that prospect or salesperson goes back to their day job, they're much better equipped, whether they're calling or emailing or doing proposals, to communicate with those prospects. So not enough salespeople or too many salespeople or prospectors learn through PowerPoint or even learn through, just selling versus putting themselves in the buyer's shoes. That's one thing we're trying to encourage everyone to do more of, is one hand. On the flip side, another way to answer this question is, how is the goal of creating predictable revenue going to change in the future? Again, there's more apps today. There's going to be more and more apps in the future. There's more content today, more and more content. So on one hand, sifting through the noise is already challenging. It's just going to get harder. And as companies, like how do you stand out is going to be, just even more common theme, whether it's like how you differentiate, how you stand out, whether it's through outbound emailing or sending sales emails, whether it's through marketing. So that's going to be probably the biggest challenge going forward. There's so many apps that you send so many emails. Everyone's just flooded with information. So how do you stand out? How are you getting heard out there? Again, whatever the medium is. So that is also related to how well do you know your prospects. So it's not random that we see that as probably the number one biggest challenge, standing out in a sea of noise and having people go talk to people. Like a really simple way to get a better sense of how do we resonate with the people we're trying to be heard by.
Aaron, there's a few, as I was listening carefully and writing some of the sound bites down, and, you're absolutely right. The noise levels are at an all-time high, and I remember you and I talking about the attention deficit as well of humans having dropped by 50% in the last 10 years since the advent of mobile. And, the declining productivity rates, obviously, of salespeople, which we're highly dependent on to predict revenue, so to grow our businesses and our top-line revenue. A couple of key points, though, that I think are really quite germane for this conversation for the people that are here. One, I think, is that your point on the visceral connectivity to the real people, the real customers. We need adults learn by experiential learning, and you're right, so often we death by PowerPoint, videos, but the actual get out and talk to real customers as part of your onboarding, can be existing customers that help you, but to really get that communication dialogue tight, relevant, purposeful, is definitely a gap in the marketplace. The depth that we need in order to, get that contextual translation. So it was really refreshing to hear you're reinforcing in your programs to cut through the noise, to keep getting out to the real customers. And, we often see this with leadership teams not getting out, in enough volume to talk to the real customers firsthand. And, there's so much administrative overhead in so many of our companies, you really have to, to be very disciplined to get and cut through that noise. So really want to thank you for those very practical messages about getting into buyers' shoes. Now you get to ask me a question about the future.
Yep. Yeah, what I see is there's a lot of noise about AI, machine learning. Some might say hype. So, or a lot of it might be hype. A lot of it could be real. Obviously the idea, hey, I could just plug this thing in and create predictable results is alluring. But what do you see is what's working or not working for real in this area of AI and machine learning?
Well, we've been in the market now for about 3 years, building out these sciences and solving different use cases. And I can unequivocally say that I didn't come from a deep AI, machine learning, data sciences background. I've come from a very strong sales results background. So I was naturally curious about this statistic. 30 to 60% of sales professionals in the middle tier do not make their sales plans. We've spent billions in CRM, Aaron, right? You know that.
Mm-hmm.
What I've learned through analyzing pure data with scientists that are mathematicians, statisticians, AI, machine learning geeks, is that on good quality data sets, there is no question AI can predict future outcomes up to 95% accuracy, because we've done it. Now the question really is one of how do you take these incredibly smart algorithms and ingest them into a system that has a foundation of trust on relationships from a sales persona perspective. This, I think, next journey is going to be very much around learning to trust technology in new ways. We've seen this obviously with the results of the big chess competition, right? That was a breakthrough. But I went into this journey not knowing whether the science would be accurate or not. And I now know unequivocally that what we thought was going to happen in terms of the speed of the internet, where we all had the doubters, right? The AI cascade in terms of prime process, we're into real time. I think countries can leapfrog ahead, Aaron. I think that there's going to be a lot of charlatans that won't have the statistical depth in their predictive models. And obviously, if you're driving decisions, you want to make sure that they are really solid, right? So we've seen the maturity already of AI in the credit risk detection industry. In sales, obviously you have to have quality data in the CRM repositories, but there's also signals outside of the CRM in terms of the email interactions, the sentiment of the conversations. All of those form a puzzle. So what AI can do is basically get all the contextual permutations of all of those touch points and put it all together in real time. Whether it's the content, whether it's, who's saying what on Twitter. And so that's the journey that we're on, is basically pulling all of the puzzle together, all of the, you want to call it the breadcrumbs. They are now going to be very accessible and visible. how that manifests itself into organizations, and we're on that learning curve right now. But it's real, and now I think it's just about how we integrate that and are thoughtful. I think ethics and transparency is going to have to be part of this journey, and I think that there'll be new audit practices, Aaron, developed too from the big accounting firms, where they will validate the algorithms in fact are bringing the value to the table. So I do think the security regulators will start popping up more in this conversation as these sciences move more into the market. So hopefully that gives you context, but I'm not a doubter. I'm well past that stage. And I must admit, when we had our first blind test with a very large company, we just did another one with one of the largest chip manufacturers in the world, where they hide the outcomes, and you just have to say, okay, can the science predict the outcomes? And we hit 87 or 88% accuracy blindfolded. And that's way better than a human can. Is you're going to win or lose, right? You're only at 50-50. So that prioritization, again, you've got to have quality data, but the science, in large data sets in particular, is uncannily accurate.
Good. Yep. Exciting.
And we need to get those into the predictive university. So I think this next question was a little bit for me as well, in terms of our company's ready. I think I kind of already answered that question in my prior response. I think the time now is very much for experimentation, innovating and learning, and also teaching sales professionals about some of the skills in data science. A lot of the sales professionals, as we all know, there aren't university programs for salespeople like you'd find for marketing, but they do need to increase their analytical skills in data science and statistics. And you don't always have the depth of advanced math talents in sales organizations. Sometimes those skills you find in IT shops, which is not where we need them to be. We need them right in the sales operational group. So I think we'll start to see a future generation of data scientists that have the formal education in sales organizations, and obviously with the number of universities building out these programs, a lot of folks have a great future in sales and marketing with data sciences background. So ladies and gentlemen, we've kind of come to a little bit of the end of our sort of formal comments we prepared, and we want to move into some Q&A. So while I'm sharing a couple of slides, I'd like to encourage you to type in any specific questions that you would like Aaron and myself to answer. And I just want to bridge that while you're thinking to a couple of key points. I think the first one is that top performing organizations in sales are using analytics 5 times more than lower performers. So, managing KPIs with the discipline process and monitoring your progress in that kind of continuous improvement cycle does pay off. And so I think that's an important point. Sometimes people start with certain approaches or methods and they don't sustain it. The continuity is really critical to sustain a change program. There's lots and lots of research now in the market of the value of predictive analytics. I'm just going to highlight a couple of additional points in terms of McKinsey's research, highlighting that you can drive 8% compound annual growth rate using these kinds of tools to guide decision making. Again, I just want to caution folks, you do need to ensure that the quality of the algorithms, the methods, the scientists that are building these tools, in fact, have the depth and foundation, because you're really building another risk management guidance system in many ways, into your organizations. But there's enough systemic research now on the growth, both in top line, EBITDA, stock appreciation. It's not a question anymore of is AI valuable. The question is more of what are you doing and where are you going and how are you getting there and how are you validating and continuing to improve, I'd call it the adoption rates.